Explanation. Welcome back to Global Current Lens, where headlines are decoded, strategies are exposed, and the truth about global events comes into focus. Explanation. Today's story begins on the restless waters of the Eastern Mediterranean, where a convoy of aid ships bound for Gaza has been stopped by Israeli naval forces. Explanation. On board were not only hundreds of activists, but also one of the most recognizable climate voices of our time, Greta Thunberg. The confrontation has sparked a storm of headlines, ignited global outrage, and added a fresh layer of complexity to one of the world's most enduring conflicts. Explanation. This isn't the first time humanitarian ships have tried to break the blockade on Gaza, but the involvement of more than 200 international activists and a globally famous figure has ensured this episode will not fade quietly into the news cycle. Instead, explanation, it could mark a turning point in how the Gaza blockade is challenged and how Israel navigates both domestic security concerns and international pressure. Explanation. To understand this breaking event, we'll start with what just happened, step back into the history and politics shaping it, and then look at the wider economic, strategic, and humanitarian stakes. Finally, we'll explore where this might lead, whether toward calm confrontation or something far more dangerous. Explanation. Quick context snapshot. The Gaza Strip, a narrow sliver of land along the Mediterranean coast, has long been a flashpoint of conflict. Since Hamas seized control in 2007, Israel, with backing from Egypt, has maintained a blockade by land, air, and sea. The stated aim is to prevent weapons from reaching Hamas. Critics argue the blockade has turned Gaza into what some describe as an open-air prison, restricting movement, stifling trade, explanation, and worsening humanitarian conditions for its more than 2 million residents. Aid flotillas have repeatedly attempted to challenge this blockade. Some missions in the past turned violent, most notably in 2010 when Israeli commandos boarded the Mavi Marmara, leading to deadly clashes and international condemnation. In the years since, the issue of Gaza's blockade has never been far from the global debate, even as wars and ceasefires cycle through. Into this context comes the latest mission, a coalition of international activists, humanitarian workers, and public figures attempting to deliver aid by sea. What happened next is already sending ripples far beyond the region. The immediate event reports confirm that early this morning, Israeli naval forces intercepted a flotilla of 3 ships approaching Gaza's maritime boundary. The convoy had declared its mission publicly to deliver food, medical supplies, and symbolic support for the besieged population. Among those on board were 200 activists from more than 40 countries. Their ranks included doctors, lawyers, religious leaders, and climate campaigners. A standout name, however, was Greta Thunberg. Known for her uncompromising climate activism, her presence immediately elevated the story into global consciousness. The interception unfolded quickly. According to the Israeli Defense Forces, naval units issued repeated warnings to the ships to divert toward Ashdod, an Israeli port. When the flotilla refused, commandos boarded the vessels in what the military described as a controlled, nonviolent operation. Witnesses from the ships tell a more chaotic story. Activists claim they were surrounded, communications jammed, and physically restrained as soldiers boarded. No fatalities have been reported, though several activists described rough treatment. Passengers, more than 200 individuals, were detained and transported to Israel. Officials have stated they will be processed, questioned, and likely deported. The humanitarian cargo is expected to be inspected and possibly sent to Gaza via official Israeli crossings. Greta Thunberg, according to both Israeli media and statements from her team, is among those in custody. Images of her being escorted off the ship under military guard have already circulated online, creating a symbolic flashpoint. In the immediate term, the operation appears to have ended without deadly violence. The political impact is only beginning. For Israel, this is presented as a matter of national security and law enforcement. For activists, it is proof that the blockade remains not only a humanitarian crisis but also a stage for global protest. Historical and political context. To grasp the full meaning of this episode, we need to step back. Gaza's blockade did not emerge in isolation. It is the product of decades of conflict, failed peace processes, and cycles of violence. Following Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, hopes for autonomy quickly collapsed. Hamas won legislative elections in 2006, and after a bloody split with rival Fatah seized full control in 2007, Israel and Egypt responded with a blockade restricting goods and movement in and out. The stated justification was clear: Hamas, considered a terrorization by Israel, the US and the EU had fired rockets into Israeli cities. The blockade, in Israel's view, was a defensive necessity, but the consequences for Gaza's civilian population have been severe. The United Nations human rights groups, NGOs, have repeatedly described the blockade as collective punishment. Electricity shortages, limited access to clean water, high unemployment, explanation, and restricted medical care define daily life. Gaza's economy has been strangled, and generations have grown up with little prospect of normalcy. This tension between security and humanitarian need has defined global debate. 8 flotillas emerged as a tool of protest, part humanitarian relief, part political theater. The 2010 Mavi Marmara incident was the most infamous. Israeli commandos stormed the ship after activists resisted, leading to the deaths of 9 activists and sparking international fury. Turkey, once an ally of Israel, cut ties for years. The event underscored how even non-military ships could trigger diplomatic earthquakes. Since then, smaller flotillas have attempted to breach the blockade. Usually stopped with less violence, but always with headlines. Each time, Israel framed the moves as illegitimate challenges to its sovereignty and security. Activists framed them as moral imperatives. Into this long-running standoff steps Greta Thunberg. While her activism is normally linked to climate change, she has increasingly spoken out on issues of human rights, linking climate justice to global justice more broadly. Her involvement adds both visibility and controversy, ensuring this flotilla will be remembered. Politically, the timing is critical. Israel remains deeply polarized, facing ongoing regional threats and domestic protests. Gaza, meanwhile, is still struggling under recent escalations and humanitarian crises. For governments abroad, the detention of activists, especially a high-profile figure, will revive debates over whether the blockade is sustainable or morally defensible. Global reactions within hours of the interception, governments, organizations, and media outlets began reacting. European capitals, where many of the activists originated, have called for immediate clarification. Some officials have demanded consular access, while others have questioned whether Israel's actions comply with international law. Scandinavian governments, in particular, are under pressure to respond given Greta Thunberg's prominence. Human rights groups have condemned the interception as an unjustified restriction on humanitarian aid. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have called for the release of the detainees and renewed scrutiny of the blockade itself. On social media, the images of activists being led away under armed escort have gone viral. Hashtags demanding their release trended globally within hours. Greta Thunberg's detention has become a rallying cry not just among pro-Palestinian groups, but also climate activists who see the issue as part of a broader struggle for justice. The United States, traditionally Israel's strongest ally, has so far been cautious. The State Department has reaffirmed Israel's right to protect its borders, but also noted the importance of humanitarian access to Gaza. How Washington ultimately balances these positions may shape whether this becomes another flashpoint in U.S. Middle East policy. At the United Nations, calls for an emergency session are already circulating. Some member states want an investigation into whether the interception in international waters violates maritime law. Others will seek to use the moment to push broader resolutions against the blockade. In the Arab world, the reaction has been swift. Governments and civil society groups have condemned the interception, with some framing it as evidence of double standards in global politics. For them, the presence of Western activists highlights the international scope of opposition to the blockade. In short, this is no longer just a regional issue. It has become a global headline, one that ties together activism, international law, and the enduring question of Gaza's future. Economic and strategic stakes. Why does this matter beyond the symbolism? Because the blockade and challenges to it sit at the heart of both economic survival and regional security. For Gaza, even limited shipments of humanitarian aid represent hope. Food insecurity is rampant. Hospitals struggle with shortages, and unemployment remains among the highest in the world. Each intercepted ship underscores how little agency Gazans have in controlling their own supply lines. For Israel, however, the calculus is stark. Allowing unsupervised maritime access to Gaza could open the door to weapons smuggling, rockets, drones, and materials for military infrastructure. Israel argues that past conflicts prove the risk is not theoretical. Hamas has built an arsenal despite the blockade. Without it, Israel fears its security would be gravely compromised. The interception also carries broader strategic implications. Every confrontation at sea raises the risk of diplomatic fallout. Relations with European countries already strained over settlement policies could worsen. International boycotts and divestment campaigns may gain fresh momentum. Economically, Israel faces the challenge of maintaining normal trade and tourism while managing an image of perpetual conflict. Say each viral image of soldiers detaining aid activists chips away at its narrative of stability. There are also strategic stakes for other regional actors. Egypt, which controls Gaza's southern border, quietly supports the blockade, fearing instability spilling into the Sinai Peninsula. Turkey and Qatar, meanwhile, often champion Gaza's cause, using moments like this to assert regional influence. For activists, the economic and strategic equation is different. Their goal is to expose what they see as the human cost of Israeli policy. By forcing high-profile confrontations, they aim to raise the political cost for Israel and keep Gaza's plight in the global spotlight. This interception, then, is not just about a few ships. It is about competing strategies of survival, security, and political pressure. Possible futures, where does this lead? 3 broad scenarios present themselves. 1. De-escalation. Israel processes and quickly deports the activists, including Greta Thunberg. Governments issue protests but avoid deep confrontation. Humanitarian cargo is inspected and some is allowed through to Gaza. The story fades after a few weeks, remembered mostly as another failed flotilla. Israel avoids long damage while activists regroup for another attempt in the future. 2. Limited conflict. The detention sparks ongoing diplomatic fallout. European states escalate pressure, perhaps recalling ambassadors or suspending cooperation. Protests erupt worldwide, linking Gaza's blockade to broader struggles of justice and human rights. Israel finds itself in another round of condemnation at the United Nations. So no war breaks out, Israel faces a prolonged political cost, and activists succeed in shifting global discourse more firmly against the blockade. 3. Escalation. So the situation, in spite of any activist is injured, or if legal proceedings against Greta Thunberg or others drag on, international outrage could snowball. Boycotts, sanctions, and mass protests could intensify. Gaza itself could become a focal point for renewed conflict, especially if militant groups seize on the moment to justify fresh attacks. Israel, in turn, could respond with force, triggering another round of violence. In this scenario, the interception of aid ships becomes the spark for a wider crisis. Each of these paths depends on how governments, media, and public opinion evolve in the coming days. What is certain is that the story is not over. The next moves by Israel, by the activists' home countries, explanation, and by global institutions will determine whether this event fades into the background or becomes a defining chapter in the Gaza conflict. Attention peak and big question. The image is already iconic. Armed commandos escorting a young activist whose voice has become global. It crystallizes the contradiction at the heart of the Gaza blockade. Security on one side, survival on the other. Explanation. The tension now lies not only in the physical custody of the activists, but in the custody of the narrative. Who controls the story? Insists it is enforcing law and defending itself. Activists insist they are standing against injustice and giving voice to the voiceless. Between those two poles lies the global audience, watching closely, sharing images, and deciding where their sympathies lie. And so the big question looms. Explanation. Will this interception be remembered as just another confrontation on the high seas, or as the moment when the world's patience with Gaza's blockade finally broke? This story is still unfolding. What happens to Greta Thunberg and her fellow activists will shape headlines for weeks, perhaps months. Explanation. But the deeper issue is far larger. The enduring blockade of Gaza and the balance of security, survival, and human dignity that it represents. Explanation. Here on Global Current Lens, we'll continue tracking not only the immediate developments, but also the broader currents shaping this conflict. Explanation. They may have stopped the ships, but the waves they've unleashed are already rolling outward. If you found this analysis useful, stay with us as we continue decoding the world's most complex events where strategy and survival collide.